Have you ever felt like your mind is just this absolute battlefield?
Oh, yeah, like all the time.
Right. Like
Yeah.
there is this ancient, unrelenting struggle happening right behind your eyes, pitting your calm, logical reasoning against these sudden, just massive tidal waves of raw emotion.
It is, I mean, it's the defining human struggle, really.
Yeah. Like, you shouldn't send that incredibly petty text message. Your logic is practically begging you to put the phone down, but the anger is, well, it's already moving your thumbs.
Exactly. And we spend our entire lives trying to figure out how to navigate that exact internal friction.
Okay, let's unpack this because today we are taking a deep dive into a really radical, kind of mind-bending philosophical text, one that attempts to solve that exact everyday struggle. But to do it, the author doesn't just offer us, standard psychology.
No, not at all. Our goal today is to look at how this text synthesizes these completely different fields.
Right, because we are taking a journey that starts with how to control a fit of rage and then somehow zooms all the way down to the quantum level,
Yeah.
like dealing with the actual physical building blocks of the universe.
And what's fascinating here is how the text treats this. It's not two separate subjects. It's one continuous spectrum.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. The argument is that you cannot understand human emotional control without understanding the literal material the human mind is built from. And the author draws a very sharp line right at the beginning between what we feel and what we think.
Yeah, the distinction between involuntary emotions and the purposeful intellect.
Hmm.
And the text categorizes emotions as entirely subconscious. Like you don't wake up and consciously schedule a feeling of sadness for, I don't know, 2 p.m.
Right. You don't pencil it in. They just happen to you.
Exactly. And they are broken down into these mirrored pairs. So you have positive forces like love, compassion, joy, and security. And those stand directly opposite the negative forces like hate, anger, sadness, and fear.
But the author is really careful to point out a major misconception here, one that honestly trips up a lot of people. Instincts are not emotions.
Yes. Which brings up a really crucial distinction about like hardware versus software. Because when I first read this, I assumed our biological drives were just the same as our feelings.
And many people do. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of how the body works, instincts are purely mechanical. Like a bird gathering twigs to build a nest isn't acting out of some, deep swelling emotion of domestic bliss.
Right, it's not decorating a nursery.
Exactly. It is running a biological program. It's a physical instinct.
And the text even applies this to humans in a way that really surprised me. Think about what happens when you get genuinely furious. Your heart rate spikes, your face flushes red, maybe the veins in your neck start to bulge.
Yeah, the physiological response.
Right. The author argues that those reactions are physical instincts. They are the hardware reacting, and that is completely separate from the internal, invisible feeling of anger itself, which is, I guess, the software.
Separating those two things is really the only way we can introduce the concept of the intellect. In this framework, the intellect is defined by conscious will and deduction.
So is the manager.
Yes, exactly. If the emotions are these involuntary, wild forces happening to us, the intellect's entire purpose is to act as the captain. Without it, the text argues, a human being would simply descend into total madness. You'd just be driven purely by whatever random feeling washed over you in that specific moment.
But the text uses this specific word, pain. The intellect must tame the emotions. And I want to look at that word carefully because taming doesn't mean destroying or suppressing them.
No, not at all.
It's less like a dictator throwing people in a dungeon and more like, say, an audio engineer sitting at a mixing board.
Oh, I like that analogy. The audio engineer doesn't want silence, right? They want harmony.
Right. The intellect has to pull the slider all the way down on something like sudden panic. But it also allows positive emotions like joy and compassion to just flow freely. And here's the really interesting part. Sometimes the intellect has to deliberately push the slider all the way up on a negative emotion.
Yeah, the text provides a perfect scenario for this involving anger. Imagine you were confronted by a cruel oppressor, someone who is committing a true, undeniable injustice.
In that specific moment, compassion or joy are entirely useless tools.
Exactly. Anger is the required response.
So taming means holding that anger back when the barista gets your coffee order wrong. But deploying it with full force when you are fighting actual tyranny, it's all that appropriate application.
But this raises a really important question. If the intellect is this supreme audio engineer making these incredibly complex, high-level decisions about when to deploy anger or foster love, what is actually doing the thinking?
See, that is exactly where I got stuck. If my intellect is the supreme commander keeping me from madness, what actually is it? Like physically? Is it just some magical invisible ghost hovering around in the gray matter of my brain?
And that is exactly the wall the author hit. To answer it, he realized he had to completely abandon traditional biology.
He had to go deeper.
Much deeper. He zooms past the brain, past the cellular structure, right down to the subatomic level, which brings us to a defense the author published in a 1963 edition of a magazine called Al-Ulum.
That was issue number 8, right?
Correct. Issue number 8. He was responding to a critic named Safi al-Dik. And in this response, the author lays out this wild theory that matters itself, the fundamental stuff that makes up everything you see around you, that it is inherently conscious.
Yeah. The author introduces this concept of mental atoms. He specifically argues that photons, particles of light, are these mental atoms, and that they form the basis of all physical matter.
And he anchors this massive, universe-altering claim on a very old, very sturdy philosophical rule. Translated from Arabic, it essentially means one cannot give what they do not possess.
Let me try to put this into a modern context for everyone listening, because this rule is really the hinge for the entire theory. It's like saying you cannot build a working, ringing, glowing smartphone entirely out of wooden blocks.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Because it does not matter if you have a billion wooden blocks. And it doesn't matter how cleverly you stack them or arrange them. Wood simply does not possess the inherent capacity to conduct complex electricity or display digital pixels.
It just doesn't have the properties.
Exactly. The raw materials must inherently contain the fundamental properties required for the final product.
And the author applies that exact logic directly to the human mind. If the base matter of the universe, atoms, photons, quarks, if they were entirely dead, entirely non-rational, and completely devoid of any awareness, then a human brain built out of that dead matter could never suddenly produce consciousness.
Right? Like a pile of dead rocks can't suddenly have an existential crisis no matter how you arrange the rocks.
Precisely. If the final product, meaning you, has consciousness, then the building blocks must have a baseline version of that exact same property. Therefore, the atoms themselves possess mental faculties.
And the text gets incredibly specific about this. It doesn't just say atoms have a spooky vibe or energy. The author literally lists 5 distinct faculties that these microscopic mental atoms possess: will, memory, perception, deduction, and recall.
We should really pause on those because the implications are staggering. He argues that even the very first, most primitive living organism on Earth, like a single cell floating in some primordial soup, it needed these exact faculties just to survive its first few moments.
Okay, let's test that because I get memory. The text points out that for a single-celled organism to make any purposeful movement, like moving toward a nutrient or swimming away from a toxin, it requires a preserved idea of what to seek or avoid.
Right, without a memory of what is good or bad, any movement is just random mechanical bouncing.
Exactly. It's the difference between a rock rolling down a hill because of gravity and a living thing actively swimming against a current. The latter requires intent, and intent requires memory. So I buy the memory aspect. But I really have to push back on deduction.
How so?
Well, I'm reading this list of faculties, I'm thinking, how does a subatomic particle, or even a single-celled organism, use deduction? It's not sitting there solving algebra or reading Sherlock Holmes. How does a photon deduce anything?
Well, deduction at that fundamental level isn't about complex mathematics. It's about basic causality. If A, then B.
Okay, rudimentary logic.
Exactly. If an organism encounters an obstacle, it has to deduce that forward movement is no longer viable, and therefore it must alter its course to survive. It's the most primal form of logic. If base matter didn't have this rudimentary if-then capacity, life could never have learned to navigate its environment in the first place.
So we're talking about life not accidentally stumbling into consciousness over billions of years of evolution. The text is claiming consciousness as a fundamental, day-one property of the universe that allowed life to begin moving purposefully at all.
That is the core argument. The building blocks of reality are awake.
Okay, but here is where it gets really interesting, and honestly, where I start to see a massive problem with the theory.
Oh.
Yeah, if you and I are essentially just walking, talking meat suits made of billions and billions of independent, conscious mental atoms, each with their own tiny little will and memory, why aren't we just a chaotic mess?
You mean, why do you feel like a single, unified person?
Yes. If every single atom has a will, why doesn't my left arm decide it wants to go to the beach while
Mm.
my right leg decides it wants to take a nap? Why don't we just instantly dissolve into a cloud of atomic self-interest?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's the exact reason the author introduces the concept of the primary cell. Nature prevents us from dissolving into atomic chaos by relying on a strict, unyielding chain of command.
And the ultimate boss.
Just as those subatomic mental particles must coalesce around a leader particle to form a stable atom, the trillions of cells in a living human body must operate under a rigid hierarchy. Without a definitive leader cell, biological and mental unity is impossible. The organism would literally break apart.
And the author states this primary cell is located in the brain. Which, I mean, the logic he uses is pretty blunt, though it's hard to argue with.
He goes straight for the undeniable.
Yeah, he points out that if you remove an organism's entire brain all at once, the organism dies instantly. It's a total systemic collapse. But you can remove other limbs, or even certain internal organs, and the organism can survive. The argument being the body only collapses instantly when the supreme commander is forcibly removed from the field.
But he goes further than just general anatomical observations. To prove this theory of cellular leadership, the author cites a very specific scientific experiment. He references a 1958 experiment on frog eggs documented in a magazine called Al-Mukhtar.
On page 107, to be exact. I was reading this section carefully because it's so incredibly specific. Scientists put a fertilized frog egg under a microscope and watched it begin the whole process of division. It went from 2 cells to 4 to 8, 16, up to 32 cells.
A standard biological process.
Right. But then the scientists physically intervened. They deliberately destroyed cell number 1, the original cell.
And the result of that intervention is basically the cornerstone of his biological argument.
The entire development process instantly stopped. The organism died. The other 31 cells didn't just, keep going or elect a new leader. The author uses this specific 1958 experiment as his concrete proof that cell 1 was the undisputed primary cell, actively leading, commanding, and holding the other cells together.
He views that biological death as the collapse of a chain of command. When the general falls, the army scatters.
Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, wait, are they seriously basing a universal theory of human consciousness and cellular hierarchy on a single frog egg from 1958? You are definitely not alone, because that feels like a monumental leap.
It is a massive leap, and that skepticism was completely shared at the time. Which brings us back to the critic from 1963, Safi al-Dik.
He wasn't buying it either.
He read this theory about the primary cell and this rigid top-down hierarchy, and he asked a brilliant, truly devastating follow-up question.
I call this the genius trap.
It really is. Safi al-Dik essentially said, okay, let's assume you're right. Let's assume all cells are just taking orders in a strict chain of command, passing down instructions from one primary cell generation after generation. If every offspring cells are always secondary, always just following the biological blueprint passed down from the parent, how do humans ever get smarter?
It's such a good point. If everything is just a copy of a copy, taking orders for the primary cell, how do you explain a brilliant, world-changing genius being born to totally average parents? Where does the new spark come from if the atoms are just blindly following the old boss's orders?
And the author's response to this critic is what gives us the final, really beautiful piece of the puzzle. He explains how the intellect actually evolves. He tells the critic that they fundamentally misunderstood what makes a cell secondary.
He separates the idea of management from the idea of potential.
Exactly. The author clarifies that a secondary cell is only less capable in its capacity for leadership, its authority to run the body's physical systems. It is not necessarily less capable in its potential for imagination, art, science, or complex thought.
So the hierarchy keeps the body from physically falling apart, but it doesn't lock the mind into a stagnant box.
Right.
The author says genius isn't just about the atomic starting point you inherit. You aren't permanently limited by your parents' mental atoms. The intellect actually expands through interaction with the outside environment.
If we connect this back to our earlier discussion about the audio engineer taming the emotions, we see that the intellect is not a static piece of hardware. Exposure to the sciences, engaging with deep philosophical arts, maintaining good physical health, and simply growing up in an environment that actively challenges you. All of these external factors literally expand the mind's horizon.
So what does this all mean? The author is arguing that it's this exact combination, the innate, rational mental atoms you are born with, colliding with the environmental cultivation you experience every single day. That is what creates genius. It is what allows an individual's intellect to completely surpass their ancestors.
We are not just rigid machines passing down a stagnant biological code. We are made of conscious matter that learns, adapts, and elevates itself through lived experience.
When you look at the whole picture, it is a
Yeah.
brilliantly unifying theory. Like, we started with the very real, immediate psychological need for our intellect to act as an audio engineer, constantly adjusting the dials to tame our unruly, involuntary emotions.
And then we follow the author's logic downward, realizing that this engineer isn't a ghost. It is a physical structure made of fundamentally conscious mental atoms, organized into a strict cellular hierarchy governed by a primary cell, simply to keep us from dissolving into atomic chaos.
But because those fundamental atoms possess memory, deduction, and will, they are entirely capable of evolving. They can achieve genius through the daily friction of life, the art we consume, and the science we study. The text connects the macro, everyday struggle of emotional control directly to the micro-reality of quantum biology.
It forces you to completely reevaluate what a thought actually is. Your thoughts aren't just fleeting clouds of abstract energy, they are the active, physical interactions of deeply ancient conscious matter organizing itself and trying to understand the universe.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, looking beyond just our own human biology. Because if our intellect is built from mental atoms that learn and evolve based on our environment, then every piece of art you look at and every emotion you successfully tame today might literally be upgrading the microscopic building blocks of your mind for tomorrow.
It's a huge responsibility, really.
It is. Are you feeding your mental atoms the right material? Or, taking it even further, if we take silicon, which under this theory is also made of base mental atoms, and we arrange it into a complex enough hierarchy to build artificial intelligence, are we just doing a math trick? Or, based on the author's rules, are we inadvertently building a trapped, synthetic mind? If the building blocks are awake, what happens when we start building with them?
That completely reframes the whole AI debate. It's a really profound question to walk away with.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it sparked some new ideas for you, and we warmly encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep giving your mental atoms something fascinating to deduce. Until next time.